Welcome to Crown TV. Immerse yourself with a captivating audio from our stories. We provide an alternative way to read books in audio. We upload many audiobooks as possible, from bestsellers to timeless classic. Subscribe and stay tuned for new upload.
Episode 276, Confession. What happened? Julian asked as he watched Chris put away his phone. Julian's father and mother also looked at Chris. Saul killed my men, Chris said gloomily. He wanted to kill Saul for threatening him on the phone like that. Julian's family were shocked at the news. Julian cried out in panic. Didn't you send 6 people to kill Saul? Didn't you threaten him with his girlfriend? How could they have been killed? What else did he say? Shut up! Chris stared at him. He had already been in a bad mood and didn't need Julian adding to it. Julian stopped talking as he realized that he had upset Chris. He tried to flatter him. Sorry, I'm being too talkative, but there are thousands of ways to deal with him. When he falls into our hands, he'll know he's as good as gone. Chris didn't listen to him. Saul had said on the phone that he was going to make Chris pay. He had said some nonsense about his family and his money. He was angling to find the way to hurt Chris the most. The idea of Saul creeping upon him to get revenge made Chris clench his fists tightly in anger. When Chelsea Wood obtained the fingerprints that were on the pistol from Julian's villa, she found the results were just as Alex had said they would be. They had found Alex, Julian, and Saul's fingerprints on the gun's body. But only Julian and Saul had left fingerprints on the trigger. This showed that Alex had not shot Julian. But according to Alex's previous confession, he had coerced Saul to shoot Julian, so he had still broken the law. Chelsea sympathized with Alex and was angry at Julian and Chris for their arrogance and horrible behavior. But whatever her personal feelings, her responsibility was to uphold the law. She returned to her office, deep in thought. Ma'am, we've received a phone call from Saul. He's at Suite 903 Middle Street, reported a police officer. Her spirits rose after hearing the news. Saul called the police? Yes, we were surprised to hear the police report, the officer said. Saul only said that he was in Suite 903 Middle Street, and then he hung up. Officer Wood, what do you make of it? I don't know, she thought. But she looked at the officer and said, Let's go now. Yes, replied the officer, and followed her toward the hall. Chelsea took 4 officers with her and got in the police car. They drove to Saul's location on Middle Street. When they arrived at Suite 903, Chelsea still had lots of doubts about Saul's phone call. She wondered what kinds of tricks he might be up to. They moved slowly toward the door and communicated with each other using gestures. Dwight took the initiative to go to the door first. The first officer to enter a room was responsible for reporting the situation to the rest of the team. It was a very risky role, especially if the suspects were still inside. He wanted to be the first person to rush in after kicking the door open. Chelsea raised her right hand to stop him and gave him a stern look. She was the team's leader, so she should do the most dangerous task. She took her responsibility seriously, especially at critical moments like this. She quietly walked toward the door and used her fingers to count down from 3. As soon as the countdown was over, she kicked in the door. She raised her gun and scanned the room. When she signaled, the other police officers rushed in. She quickly found Saul. "Don't move!" she shouted. The other officers pointed their guns at him. But they soon discovered that they didn't need to be nervous. Saul had not played any tricks or lied on the phone. He sat silently on the ground, holding a dead woman in his arms. The scene in the room shocked the officers. 5 or 6 dead people were lying on the ground in big pools of blood. The room smelled of blood, which made one of the officers nauseous. "Here you are at last," Saul said, as he slowly turned his eyes toward Chelsea. He acted like a robot, without a trace of emotion. He had been feeling blank and empty since his girlfriend's death. "You killed all these people?" Chelsea asked. "Yes, I killed them all," Saul said calmly. He continued, "I turned myself in. I also take responsibility for the shooting at Julian's house a few hours ago. Chris Stedman hired me to kill 2 university security guards, but I failed. They were furious with me. I was so angry that I shot Julian. Chris sent these people to kill me, and they also killed my girlfriend, Danielle." Saul had no problem confessing the whole story to the police. He didn't care what happened to him next. All he cared about now was getting revenge on Chris and Julian for the death of his girlfriend. He knew they would face dire consequences when the police found out they had been paying a killer to take care of their problems. Chelsea and the other officers were surprised that Saul had admitted to his crime so readily. Not to mention named Chris and Julian as his employers. "Over the past 3 years, Chris has hired me to kill a number of people. I can tell you when, where, and why everyone was killed," Saul said. Chelsea and the other police officers were all confused. They hadn't expected that Chris, a member of the Stedman family in Baltimore, had been so personally involved in such dark business. Chelsea realized that Saul had deliberately brought them here to expose Chris. "At Julian's house, did the security guard named Alex intimidate you into shooting Julian?" Chelsea asked. "No, it was not because of him. I shot Julian for my own reasons," Saul said. This wasn't true. Alex had indeed told Saul to shoot Julian. But at that moment, Saul felt that the enemy of his enemy must be his friend. If Chris and Julian hated Alex so much, then Saul wanted to protect him. Chelsea nodded slowly, absorbing this new information. "Take him away," Chelsea said to the officers behind her. 2 officers walked towards Saul, while another pair of officers pointed their guns at him. Saul was handcuffed and pulled up to his feet. But suddenly, his eyes rolled back and he fainted. He had been shot 5 times. Chelsea knelt quickly to check if he was still breathing. "We have time," she called out. "We need to get him to a hospital right away." They called an ambulance. When it arrived, Chelsea had sent 2 police officers to follow Saul to the hospital. Chelsea and the remaining officers returned to the police station. Chelsea asked 2 police officers from the team to report to Captain Murphy. She went to the detention room where Alex was still waiting. When she arrived, Alex was lying on a small bed. All he could think about was how worried Debbie would be if she didn't see him at the university in the morning. What should I do? He thought. Alex sat up when he heard the iron bars slide open. You're quite calm, she said as she looked at him. I don't think it's any use to try and sleep. This bed is okay, but it's a little hard, he said faintly. Officer Wood, what can I do for you? You can leave now, she said. Really? He was overjoyed, but he couldn't figure out why she would let him go after such a short time. We've caught Saul. He admitted that you have nothing to do with the shooting, so you can go, she said. Chelsea told him that Saul had admitted that the shooting had been entirely from his actions. Alex's involvement had been cleared. So I can go now? He realized he was free and started to walk to the door. It had been dark in the room, so when he walked to the front, the lights in the corridor shone on his face, and Chelsea was able to see him for the first time. She saw that he had thin lips, a firm nose, and 2 eyes as dark as night. His face had a calm and gentle expression. He looked tall and stood up straight in his gray security suit. She thought back to earlier that day, when they had stumbled awkwardly in the interrogation room and accidentally kissed. Her eyes flickered slightly and her face flushed pink. Alex gulped. He was thinking about that strange accidental kiss as well. He said, Sorry about before. You should go now, she said as she stared at him. He had no choice but to leave. She followed behind him and felt bitterness in her heart as she looked at his back. You took my first kiss. How can you make it up to me? Her face burned even more. She shook her head as if trying to make the memory of their kiss fly out of their mind. Captain Finn Murphy was very happy to hear that Saul had been caught. He was relieved that he had managed to complete the task Chris Stedman had given him so quickly. You can go now, Finn told his officers. He wanted to call Chris to report the good news. As the 2 officers made their way out the door, Finn spotted Chelsea walking out with a young man. The young man appeared to be Alex, who Chris had just warned him to watch out for. He even had sent a picture so Flynn would know him on sight. What's going on? He thought. Finn quickly called out to them. Stop! He sprung from his desk and walked out of the office. Episode 277, Justice. What's going on? Finn asked Chelsea angrily as he stood in front of Alex. You, take him back to the detention room, Finn commanded the 2 police officers. They got ready to detain Alex again. Chelsea stopped the officers and said to Finn, Captain, it's been proven that Alex is innocent and should be let go. He's innocent? Who proved it? You need to bring him back here, Finn said. In his confession, Saul had been careful to say that Alex had not made him shoot Julian. Besides, the fact remained that Alex's fingerprints were not on the trigger of the gun. Chelsea said firmly, We have plenty of evidence showing that Alex is innocent. Following procedure, we should let him go. No way. Saul hasn't come to the police station to give his confession. How could I know if he said what you just said? Finn just wanted to keep Alex in the station. He knew Chris would be furious if Alex was released. Dwight and the other officers who were there with me also heard Saul's confession. Chelsea looked at the 2 police officers who had followed her to arrest Saul and said, Isn't that what Saul said? The 2 officers agreed that Saul had confessed to shooting Julian and had said Alex was not responsible. Dwight was also nearby and said with some embarrassment, "Captain, we just reported it to you. Didn't you hear us?" Once the officers had told him that Saul had been caught, Finn had barely listened to the rest of the report. He had not heard all the details. But they were right. According to the law, under such circumstances, Alex should be released. "You can go now." Chelsea pushed Alex to leave. Finn couldn't find any excuse to stop him. Watching Alex walk out of the police station's door, Finn felt very embarrassed. He didn't know how he was going to explain it to Chris. Finn looked at Chelsea in frustration. Like the other officers, he had heard rumors that Chelsea came from a very influential family, and he didn't feel confident enough to fight her on this. He had to swallow his anger. He quickly walked into his office and slammed the door. He sat fuming in his chair until he heard someone knock. "Who is it?" he roared impatiently. "It's me," Chelsea called through the door. "There's something I want to ask you." But he was too angry to listen. "I need to make a phone call to report to my superiors. We'll talk about it later," he shouted. "Good," Chelsea shouted back from outside his door. He glared at his door angrily. But finally, he picked up the phone and thought about how he would report this to Chris. After several minutes, he couldn't think of anything good to say. He knew that Chris would be furious that he had allowed Alex to leave. But he had no choice. He had to report it. He sighed and dialed Chris's number. Chris answered his phone quickly when he saw that Captain Murphy was calling him. He hoped that he would have some good news. "What happened?" Chris asked. It was a simple question, but it made Finn tremble. Finn's heart jumped. He knew he had to tell Chris that Alex had been released, but he was too terrified to spit it out. Instead, he said, "Chris, we've caught Saul." The two officers had reported to him that Saul's motive to call the police had been to expose Chris at the scene of the arrest. Chris's bad mood improved slightly. "Okay, that's very good. Like Alex, you should convict him as soon as possible. The more punishment, the better. As long as you get them into prison and keep them there, you don't have to worry about anything else. I'll take care of them." Hearing Chris mention Alex, Finn grew more nervous. He knew he had to tell him what had happened. Finn summed up his courage and finally said, "Chris, something happened. The security guard named Alex was released." "What do you mean he was released?" Chris's voice grew louder, which made Finn's heart skip a beat. "Alex's fingerprints were on the gun, but not the trigger. The only people who left fingerprints on the trigger were Julian and Saul. After the arrest, Saul made it clear that he was the only one responsible for shooting Julian. He said Alex had nothing to do with it. So we had to release Alex," Finn said quickly. "So what?" Chris asked coldly. "You're a captain. Can't you handle this little problem?" He thought that it would be simpler for Finn to use his power to detain Alex at the police station. "Chris, this time it's a little different," Finn said in a bitter voice as sweat dripped from his forehead. "How different?" Chris asked suspiciously. He thought Finn was just trying to make excuses for himself. "The person who arrested Alex and Saul is a special case. As long as she's in charge, it's going to be tough for me to intervene. Finn expressed his bitterness. Are you teasing me? Chris asked incredulously. He didn't understand how some officer could interfere with the captain of the precinct's work. It sounded ridiculous. Chris, please don't misunderstand, Finn said quickly. This officer is not an ordinary person. It's Chelsea Wood. You've heard of her family. She was an officer in another state, but they transferred her to our precinct because her family was worried about her safety. Chris's anger cooled slightly. The Wood family had a lot of influence in Baltimore, and its strength was almost the same as that of his family. Many of the family members were officials, especially in the police system. Of course, Finn was afraid to fight Chelsea on this. Chris had heard of Chelsea. She graduated from university with excellent results. After that, she volunteered to be a police officer. It had been said that her goal since childhood had been to be an excellent officer to protect the people. Maybe she had been inspired by some of her family members. Can you make it so she's not in charge of the case? Chris suggested. Chris, you don't know what she's like. Once she's given a task, she won't give up halfway. I tried to force her to ignore the whole thing when it first came up. Even if I could somehow remove her, she would probably keep tracking its progress. If she sees anything unusual, she'll intervene. Chris swore angrily. Well, at least you've got Saul. Lock him up in a detention room and then I'll deal with the matter later. I'll solve the problem with that annoying security guard myself. Yes, Finn responded quickly. He was relieved when he heard Chris hang up. There were 2 knocks at his door. Finn remembered that before he had called Chris, Chelsea had wanted to ask him something. He didn't want to see her. If she had been an ordinary police officer, he would have gotten rid of her, but he couldn't afford to upset her family. Come in, he shouted. She walked in calmly. What's the matter? He asked politely, so she would finish quickly and leave. She said forcefully, Captain, I request to go to Union Medical College Hospital to arrest Chris and Julian. He almost vomited. What? You want to arrest Chris and Julian? He exclaimed. Yes, she said. When we arrested Saul, he said that Chris and Julian had ordered him to kill Alex and Don, the university security guards. He also confessed that he's killed many people for Chris over the years. After he receives treatment and his physical condition improves, we can get the rest of his official statement. Based on this information, I believe that Chris and Julian have committed serious crimes. I demand that they be arrested and brought to justice as soon as possible, so as to not threaten the lives of other citizens. She finished speaking. Finn's heart went cold. Letting Alex would have been bad enough. But if Chelsea managed to arrest Chris and Julian as well, things could turn out very badly. Chelsea, we've only heard Saul's side of the story. We aren't sure about the specific situation. I don't think we should be making arrests with so little information to go on, he said, trying to buy time. When Saul spoke, he was holding his dead girlfriend in his arms, and he confessed all his crimes. In my opinion, at least 90% of what he said was true. Since Chris can hire murderers to kill people, it proves that he's an extremely dangerous person. He's a time bomb. Captain, I'm asking you to let me bring in Chris and Julian immediately, she said. He slapped his desk. Who's the captain here? How did you get into the force? Obeying orders is your duty as a police officer. Get out of my office. He wanted to shock her. She was going to give him trouble. Captain, the police's duty is to help the weak and punish violence. The purpose of the police is to serve the people. This has been engraved in my mind for as long as I can remember. No matter what, I'll never forget it, she said. She continued, I'm going to arrest Chris and Julian. She turned on her heel and walked to the door. Come back here now, he yelled. But she didn't stop. Episode 278, A Good Officer. Follow me. We're going to the hospital to arrest Chris and Julian, Chelsea called as she passed a few police officers. When Chris had called the police, he had said that he was with Julian at the hospital. Chelsea figured he was probably still there. The officers were surprised when they heard that she was going to arrest the two men. They had all heard rumors about how powerful Chris and Julian were in Baltimore. You can't go! Finn ran out of his office, looking at the other officers, and said, This case is not clear, so no one can arrest Chris and Julian yet. He knew Chris would have his head if his own officers showed up to arrest him and Julian. He was desperate to stop them from making trouble. Chelsea glanced over at the other officers. When she met their eyes, they all lowered their heads. She knew that they didn't have the courage to go with her. She would go alone. She wasn't the kind of person to let other people's opinions affect her own actions. She turned toward the door. Officer Wood, wait for me. I'll go with you. It was the young police officer who had choked and vomited from the bloody smell at Saul's girlfriend's residence. Layla Napier, Finn called out. Captain, I heard what Saul said. Chris and Julian have paid to have people killed. They should be arrested, Layla said a little timidly to Finn, and then ran after Chelsea to go to the hospital. Finn was very angry with Chelsea. If he hadn't been in the police station, he would have thrown things and shouted to vent his anger. He went back to his office and slammed the door. He walked back and forth a couple of times. He had to report this to Chris immediately, but he feared that Chris would want to kill him as soon as he told him. The police station was only a 20-minute drive from the hospital. If you don't call him now, she'll arrive at the hospital before he can prepare. Just call him, he thought as he made up his mind. He picked up the phone and dialed Chris's number. At Union Medical College Hospital, Julian had been furious when he had heard that Alex had been released by the police. But he didn't dare to complain out loud. Chris was sitting quietly near him, and he didn't want to upset him. Julian's parents sat by the bed and quietly comforted their son. They said that they would get revenge on Alex for him. Chris's phone rang. He was puzzled when he saw that the call was from Finn. Did Finn take Alex to the police station again? He thought. Chris answered and asked, What happened? Chris, Chelsea is on her way to the hospital to arrest you and Julian, Finn said. She's coming for me? He clenched his phone. Chelsea Wood was really starting to get on his nerves. What? Who's coming? Julian also heard the voice. He said angrily, What now? I was crippled by Saul and that security guard, and now they're coming back for more? What's their reason? Finn said, Chelsea said that you and Julian hired Saul to kill the two security guards. After he failed, you sent men to pursue him. He also said that in the past 3 years, he helped you kill several people. He has enough evidence to prove that what he said is true. Well, so what if it was me? As a member of the Wood family, she doesn't seem to be taking me seriously as a Stedman. I'd like to see what she thinks she can do to me, Chris said coldly. He hung up and slammed his phone down onto the table so hard that the screen shattered. Who does she think she is, trying to mess with us? If she dares to touch me, I'll slap her, Julian said. When she comes, I'll see how good she is, Chris said with a slight sneer. He shouted, "Nurse!" A nurse pushed the door open. He demanded, "Pour me a cup of coffee." A few minutes later, Chelsea and Layla arrived at the hospital. They learned which room was Julian's from the doctors and walked in that direction. When they arrived, Chelsea pushed the door open. Chris was sitting in a chair leisurely sipping coffee and didn't raise his head to look at her. "What are you doing here?" Julian angrily looked at Chelsea and said, "Is it to see if I'm really injured? Well, I am. Leave my room now." "Hello, I'm Chelsea Wood. I'm a police officer from the Central District Precinct." She showed them her badge. She said, "According to the information we have, you two are suspected of hiring murderers. Mr. Stedman was involved in hiring Saul, who killed many people for him. Mr. Devant, I see that you are seriously injured. The police will allow you to receive treatment in the hospital first. But Mr. Stedman needs to go back to the police station with us for further questioning." "What do you think you're doing? What are these accusations? Get out of here. You can't move my nephew." Julian's mother tried to stop Chelsea. "Sorry," Chelsea said. She gently pushed Julian's mother out of her way and walked toward Chris. "Mr. Stedman." Although she was angry, she tried to speak courteously to him. She grabbed his hand and prepared to handcuff him. "Officer Wood." He looked at her and said, "I think you know who I am. If I'm seen in a police station, do you know how much impact this will have on my reputation of my family? Are you not afraid of destroying the peaceful relationship between our families?" "We have reliable information. As a police officer, I can't turn a blind eye to it," she insisted. "Saul? Hasn't it occurred to you that he might be trying to shift blame over to me to protect himself?" he asked in a sharp voice. She said, "According to the current evidence, we need to arrest you. There's no room for discussion. When Saul comes back to the police station, he will give the rest of his statement. We will investigate and let you go if you're innocent. But if we find evidence that you've done anything illegal, then it'll be a different story." She clicked the handcuffs onto his wrist. "Well, just remember that if I'm wronged, I'll make you pay for it," Chris said coldly, staring at her. She didn't pay any attention to his threat. "Stand up and come back to the police station with me." She pulled him up, looked back at Julian and said, "We'll send police officers to the hospital tomorrow to take turns taking care of you until your injury improves. Once you're able to go, they'll take you to the station. Let's go." Chelsea and Layla pulled Chris out of the room. However, Chelsea was mindful that it could cause a great deal of fuss if anyone saw that someone from the Stedman family was being arrested, so she covered the handcuffs with her scarf. The next morning, Alex got up, went for a run, and walked to the cafeteria for breakfast. In the morning at Johns Hopkins University, many diligent students got up early for breakfast, and then they trotted off to the library or study room. Although they were at a good university and already in a good position in society, they knew they still needed to work hard to succeed. Alex arrived at the gate of Debbie's family home and waited. At 20 after 7 in the morning, Debbie came out of the house. She carried a small backpack. When she spotted him, she ran over to him with a giggle. "You look tired. What time did you go to bed last night?" she asked with concern as she looked at his dark eyes. With all the excitement the night before, he hadn't made it back to the residences on campus until nearly 3 in the morning. "Oh," he scratched his nose, thought quickly and said with a smile, "I watched a movie until late last night and didn't get enough sleep." They walked toward the security building where he worked. "You should go to bed after work," she said. She looked around and asked, "Why is Don absent?" "Don asked for a few days off," he said. He didn't want her to know what had happened to him and Don the night before. She said goodbye to him and went to class. He was relieved. He got out his phone and called Don, but his sister Daisy answered. "Alex, how are you? My brother is worried about you. The police didn't embarrass you, did they? Do you need my brother to go to the police station and make a statement?" she asked anxiously. His heart warmed. "Don't worry about me. I have left the police station. It's okay now," he said. "That's good news," she exclaimed. "How's your brother doing?" He heard her talk to her brother. "Don, Alex is all right. He's been released. I told you it would be okay. He's a good guy. Nothing bad could happen to him." She said, "Alex, my brother, is in very good condition. The doctor said that he had a slight concussion. He has 7 stitches on his forehead, and his legs and back are contused. As long as he rests for 3 to 5 weeks, he can be discharged for rehabilitation." "Well, that's good news," he replied. Don took the phone and said, "Alex, thank you. Thank you so much." "Don, there's no need to say thank you again. It's good that you'll be okay," he said. Don had mixed feelings. "I'll definitely pay you back the medical fees that you covered for me. Although we can't work together again in the future, you can rest assured that I'll never default on my account." Alex knew that he couldn't pay back that kind of money on his own. He felt sorry for him. "What do you mean? Aren't you working as a security guard?" he asked. "It's not that I won't do it again. It's that the Stedman family won't let me continue. I still think they might try to get revenge on us again. Besides, I'm injured again, and I don't know how long it'll take me to recover. Do you really think that Chief Lewis will let me take sick leave for that whole time? I just called him to tell him about my injury. Although he didn't make it clear, I think I'll be dismissed in the next couple of days," he said. Episode 279, He Can't Go. Alex thought that Don was probably right. Chief Lewis would probably dismiss him. Alex felt responsible for causing Don trouble, and he didn't want to let him lose his job over a confrontation he hadn't wanted to be part of in the first place. "Don, you may be overthinking it. I think he might be more understanding," Alex said. "But," Don said. "Don, you focus on having a good rest. I'm on duty, so I need to say goodbye now." He hung up the phone. He was due to start work at 9:30, so he headed in. As soon as Alex walked into the security office, he found that the rest of the security guards were chatting enthusiastically instead of staring at their phones as usual. "Well, there were 2 shootings last night and lots of people died. You all don't know because it's under wraps." "I heard it was at Middle Street. They said there was intense gunfire after 1 in the morning, like a movie," 7 or 8 people were killed and only one survived. Do you know who it was? His name is Saul. I can tell you haven't heard of him. I'm telling you, Saul's not an ordinary person. He's an underground boxer in Baltimore. He's invincible in the ring. One particular middle-aged security guard with glasses was the most informed and boastful one in the group. The other guards were very excited about the information he had to share. It's amazing, a gunfight. I've never seen anything like that around here, said another guard, slapping his thigh. He said, this is the most exciting thing to happen in ages. Who could top that? All the guards glanced curiously at the middle-aged guard. That shooting involved a lot of people, true, but there was one other scene that night that was even more exciting. Not as many people were hurt, but the people who were attacked were very important. Do you know who was shot? The guard asked, smiling at them. Who was it? They all leaned in curiously. It was Julian Devant and Chris Stedman. Saul attacked them and shot Julian. But he didn't die, he's just injured. As soon as the middle-aged guard finished speaking, the other guards shared shocked reactions. Everyone knew how important Julian and Chris were. Wow, it's so exciting. It won't be reported in the news. The Stedman and Devant families will keep it quiet, like they always do. The middle-aged guard shook his head. I can't believe it. Saul dared to shoot a rich guy like Julian and kill all those other people in one night. Alex stood behind them and listened carefully. He felt a little relieved when he heard that the middle-aged security guard didn't know that he and Don had been involved in the 2 shootings. Alex, if you were there, you would have pissed your pants. Another guard laughed as he looked at him. Since he had joined their team, the security guards had begun to joke around with him. Yes, I don't have Saul's talents, Alex said with a smile. He went to Chief Lewis's office to ask about Don. Chief Lewis, can I talk to you? Alex said as he walked to Tony's desk. What's going on with Don? Don called and told me that he needs to stay in the hospital for a month. I listened to his tone and didn't like it. It's likely that it'll have an impact on his actions after he leaves the hospital. I thought about it last night and I've decided to dismiss him, he said. Tony normally wouldn't have shared so much information with one of his staff. But he knew Alex had important connections with the Clifton family, so it seemed worth it to be honest with him. Why did you want to dismiss him? Alex was slightly surprised. Don had guessed well. This university is not a place for idle or troublesome people. It sounds like he's got a lot of problems, and he needs to take responsibility for himself. As the chief of security here, it'll be my fault if he brings that trouble here. I could get in a lot of trouble myself. It's no good. Don has to go. Tony spoke quickly and didn't give Alex a chance to interrupt. But from the way Tony described his thought process, Alex got the feeling the chief didn't understand what had happened. Chief Lewis, how did Don ask you for leave yesterday? Don told me that his sister was ill and he had to go home. What's the matter? Tony asked. The previous day, Don had been afraid to let Tony know what had happened because of Julian and Chris. So he had hidden the truth from Tony. Alex shook his head. No, he lied to you. Yesterday we stood guard in the front of the student residence halls on campus. Julian Devant and Chris Stedman wanted to go in, but we refused to let them. They got aggressive. I slapped Julian in the face and they both left. Don was worried they would be back to get even. What? Tony was startled. You provoked Julian Devant and Chris Stedman? Tony had heard other people whispering this morning about something that had happened to Julian and Chris. He wondered if it had been related to Alex and Don. Yes, Alex said. You should have heard that something happened to Julian and Chris last night. Tony trembled again. He couldn't believe that incident had been related to his guards. Alex continued. Julian and Chris sent Saul to kill us. Saul beat Don until he was seriously injured. After that, Julian was shot. Don was sent to the hospital, and I was taken to the police station for questioning. Tony looked him up and down. He looked okay, which meant that Saul had not beaten him up. Did Alex defeat him? Did the 2 shootings last night have anything to do with him? He thought. Even though the incident involved such important people, Alex had been released from the police station and reported for work as if nothing had happened. Tony wondered how much power Alex had. What did this mean? Then, he had a terrible idea. Is he more powerful than the Stedman and Duvant families? He thought again about how Rufus Clifton had phoned him up, demanding that Alex be given a job. Maybe Alex was important. Are you still going to fire Don? Alex looked at Tony's eyes in doubt. No, I won't. Don is very good at what he does. He should stay, Tony said, changing his tone quickly. I totally agree with you. Chief Louis Don was admitted to the hospital because he was injured by Chris and Julian, just for the sake of maintaining the rules of the university. Can't this be regarded as a work-related injury? Alex asked. With Don's personality, Alex knew he would do everything he could to pay back the money Alex had given him for his medical fees. But if it was recorded as a work-related injury, Don could get money from the university instead of digging into his savings. He had a work-related injury? Tony was very embarrassed. He understood that Alex was trying to get the university to pay for Don's medical expenses. His medical expenses are more than $15,000. I think you can do this. Don't worry about Chris and Julian. They won't want to look bad by admitting they were beaten by a security guard, so no one will know. Can you look into getting his expenses covered? He asked again. Well, I'll try to apply for him, Tony said. Well, thank you, Chief Louis. I'll go on patrol now, Alex said, and walked out of the office. At the same time, Chris was being held in a detention room. The previous night, Chelsea had taken him to the police station. She had to record his confession, but Chris had said nothing all night. Captain Murphy had made the other police officers take him to the detention room to rest. After Chelsea had left, Finn went into the room to see Chris. He asked his officers to bring Chris the softest mattress, quilt, and pillows in the station. Finn said everything he could think of to try to calm Chris down. He said that because of Chelsea's background, he hadn't dared to intervene. Otherwise, he wouldn't have let Chris come here to suffer. Chris vented his anger on Flynn, slapping him in the face and kicking him to the ground. Finn didn't dare defend himself. When he had been kicked, he had even smiled. He said, "As long as you can calm down, I'll let you hit me. It's worth it." But that only made Chris even more upset. He made Finn leave the detention room. Although he was angry, he knew things were going to turn out all right. Julian's mother had probably already contacted his family. His father would soon rescue him. At 10 in the morning, Chelsea went to see Chris. When she saw the quilt, mattress, and pillow on his bed, her eyes narrowed in disgust. She hated that Chris was being shown special treatment just because he was rich. Chris was still in bed, sleeping soundly. "Chris, get up," she cried. She had still gotten to work on time at 8 that morning despite working so late. She had arrested Chris around 3 in the morning. She had even delayed waking him up for a couple of hours, knowing he would probably be tired. He still slept. She went to his bedside, lifted the quilt and said softly, "Chris, get up." He opened his eyes and looked at her. His eyes were full of anger. He sat up and slowly put on his shoes. "I want to wash my face. Where can I wash?" he asked as he stood up. "You're coming with me to give a statement first." She pushed him out of the room. Just outside of the room, a man's powerful voice could be heard in the hallway. "Bring my son out to see me immediately." Chris was overjoyed. His father had come to get him. He hurried into the hall. He couldn't hear what Chelsea called out behind him. "Dad!" He walked into the hall and saw a middle-aged man in his suit with black hair and a dignified face. It was his father, Art Stedman. "Mr. Stedman, you can take your son now," Finn said with a flattering smile. "No, he can't take him," Chelsea cried. She looked at his father and said, "Your son is suspected of hiring murderers. He needs to stay in the police station for questioning." Episode 280, Cleaning Up. "Are you Chelsea Wood?" Art looked at Chelsea with a trace of contempt. In his eyes, she was a little girl who didn't know much about him. "I remember when I visited your father more than 10 years ago. Don't you recognize me?" "I don't really remember that visit," Chelsea said, trying to keep her voice calm and even. "But at the moment, your son is a suspect. I need to take him to record his confession. Please, excuse me." "Oh, wait a moment. Why are you in such a hurry?" Art showed a little dissatisfaction. She was just how his sister, Julian's mother, had described the previous night. She had a one-track mind and didn't give up easily. His head tilted slightly. The man standing behind him walked toward her. He was Art's best lawyer. The lawyer said, "Officer Wood, as far as I know, you only have notes regarding what Saul said to you at the scene. There is no written evidence. You haven't taken an official statement from him. You're not building a strong case here." "I'll call my colleague who looks after Saul." She took out her phone and called the officers guarding Saul at the hospital. "You need to put Saul on the phone. I want to talk to him right now," she said. "We can't right now. Saul's operation was over at 6 this morning, and he's still under anesthesia," said the officer. Hearing this, she couldn't help but feel depressed. She glared at Art's lawyer. "What's his condition?" she asked. "According to the doctor, the situation is still good. The 5 bullets in his body weren't in key positions, and all have been removed. After a few days, his mind will be clear. We can record his confession in the hospital," said the officer. "Okay, you two keep a good watch over Saul. If anything happens, please report to me at once." She hung up her phone. "Officer Wood, we're prepared to pay bail for our client. We're going to take him now. Do you have any questions?" asked the lawyer, smiling. She didn't want to ask him anything. She didn't want to pay attention to him or let him distract her from dealing with Chris. She looked at Chris and said, "If you're guilty, I'll take you back to the police station with my own hands." "Good." Chris approached her, smiling. He whispered, "Let's see you try."
But don't forget what I told you before. Tried to warn you. If you wrong me, I'll make you pay for it." He winked at her and laughed softly. Art took his son out of the police station. He got into a Toyota at the station's gate. Although he was rich, he wasn't the sort to indulge in luxury cars or other frivolous purchases. The lawyer said goodbye to his clients and left. As soon as he got into the car, Art's face became very gloomy. Chris, who was sitting in the front passenger seat, was very upset and didn't dare open his mouth to speak to his father. His father drove in silence to a high-end residential area in Baltimore. Although this community wasn't luxurious, it belonged to the upper middle class. Like many other people of his status, Art didn't always like to show off his wealth. But he also didn't pretend to be poor and live in low-end neighborhoods. After he had walked into the house, Art took off his coat and handed it to the housekeeper. "You come with me," he said sternly with a glance at his son. Chris followed him into the study fearfully. Chris closed the door and turned around. His father had still not said much. Suddenly, Art slapped him heavily across the face. His ears were ringing, and his face felt hot. "I want you to be careful. You want to ruin my reputation, don't you?" his father angrily scolded as he stared at Chris. Although he had been calm at the police station, he had let his fury show now. He was a senior official. If his son were exposed to committing such a big crime, his hard-earned career would collapse overnight. "Dad, I'm sorry. This is my fault. I promise I won't make the same mistake again," Chris said. "If you make the same mistake again, I'll kill you," Art said angrily. He sat in the swivel chair behind his desk and rested his head on his hands. He lifted his black hair neatly from his head. Art had started to lose his hair when he was 30 years old, so he had simply shaved it off. As his status in Baltimore had grown, he had bought himself a wig. Almost none of his colleagues knew that he was bald. He reached for a cigar box on his metal desk and took out a big cigar. Art lit it and took a deep draw of the smoke. He needed the nicotine to help calm him down. A wisp of light smoke came out from his lips, and his nerves began to settle. "There can't be any problems in this matter. Do you have any ideas on how to solve this?" he asked Chris. He was no longer as agitated as he had been previously. "Dad, don't worry. I can solve this problem," Chris said, feeling slightly relieved. "Saul has information that isn't good for me. Just let me find a way to shut him up forever." "Well, do it as soon as possible. Do it well," Art ordered. The incident had been so sudden that he had hardly been able to respond to it effectively. He didn't like being taken by surprise. "Yes, I know," Chris said. "There was news from the Blood Brothers gang yesterday," Art said. "They agreed to my request. Once we challenge the Clifton family to a showdown, they will send fighters to help us defeat that family in one fell swoop." He thought back to the conversation he had had on the phone with the gang's leader the previous day. Art had been planning to seize the underground world of Baltimore from the Clifton family. He had planned carefully, not wanting to start a fight unless he was sure he could win. Over the past few years, the underground forces that were controlled by the Stedman family had been developing. In the last 2 years, he felt that the opportunity had come for his family to replace the Cliftons. He had begun to communicate with the gang several months ago, and he'd asked them to help him with his plan. The Blood Brothers tended to be quite secretive. He knew that they were probably taking time to assess his family and decide whether or not he was worth supporting. The previous day, when he had called the gang's leader, Tyson Slade, he had finally gotten the answer he had wanted. Tyson made it clear that he supported the Stedman family in seizing Baltimore's underground world. If Art issued a challenge to the Clifton family, the gang would help him. "That's great news," the gang agreed, Chris exclaimed in surprise. He knew that his father had been communicating with them. "You should deal with this matter first, and then go and negotiate with Jessup. Just tell him what I told you before." Art smoked his cigar and thought about the negotiation between Chris and Jessup. "Dad, is it really that urgent?" Chris asked, feeling a little confused. "Urgent?" Art gave Chris a stern look. "I always taught you that time was fleeting. Our strength is at its fullest. So with the support of this gang, this is the best time. We don't know when we'll get an opportunity like this again. You can't let these things go by. You must be decisive. Do you understand?" "Yes, Dad, you're right. I'm too hesitant. As soon as I've solved the problem with Saul, I'll go see Jessup," he said. "Well, you go now and think about what you have to do." He waved his hand for his son to go. Chris left the study as quickly as he could. The next day at 6 in the morning, Saul was still asleep in his bed at the Baltimore General Hospital. Outside of Saul's room, 2 police officers were sitting in chairs. Although they were guarding him, they had leaned back and closed their eyes. Since they couldn't sleep in a bed, they were very tired. They were almost snoring. A small cart slowly rolled down the hall, its wheels clicking on the tiles. When the cart passed in front of the officers, they both woke up and looked at the person pushing the cart. The cart was about 3 feet high and made of stainless steel. It contained a blue garbage can, green water bucket, broom and mop. It was being pushed by an old woman with a wrinkled face and bent figure. Hearing the officer wake up, the old woman was startled and held her chest in fear. "I clean the hospital. Every morning I come to clean. If I can't finish cleaning this floor before 7, the hospital will fire me," said the old woman quickly to the officers. She looked at Saul's room and said, "I heard that there's a murderer in there. I'm afraid to go in. If you say that this room doesn't need to be cleaned, I can get out of doing it. But you need to go to the hospital's management office to help me tell them. This way my boss won't deduct it from my salary." The officers looked at each other. If they left their post and went to the office, they would have to go around in a big circle through the halls. They didn't want to leave the room that they were guarding. "Well, Grandma, you can go in and clean it. Don't worry, the man's still unconscious and handcuffed. It's impossible for him to hurt you, so go ahead," said one of the officers. "Okay," she sighed. She pushed the cleaning cart into Saul's room. The officers leaned back into their chairs again and began to snooze.
Thank you for listening to Crown TV. Please don't forget to subscribe, share and turn on the notification button.